Hello, everyone. This is your Week 2 lecture entitled Pilgrims and Puritans. For this week's readings, you were asked to look at some selections from William Bradford, John Winthrop, Roger Williams, and also a little bit of Thomas Morton's New English Canaan, which I'm sure was a delight to read. We're going to start off talking about the Pilgrims, who were a group of what were referred to as separatists, who came originally out of Scrooby, Nottinghamshire. They moved to Leiden in the Netherlands, and eventually came to what was called the Plymouth Colony, which they received a charter for. The Pilgrims were a church group, basically, a group of worshipers who, in a lot of ways, they were sort of one of the earliest groups of Puritans. And we'll talk a minute about who the Puritans were. But they belonged to what were referred to as covenant churches, basically independent churches that were based on worship practices and doctrines that were considered heretical by the Church of England, which they were wanting to separate from, which was illegal. In England, they had a system which combined both the civil and religious law together, and you either belonged and worshiped to the Church of England or you didn't belong or worship to any church. And it was actually considered a crime against the crown to worship at a different church because of that union between civil and religious law. William Bradford was a major leader of the Pilgrims, served as governor of the Plymouth Colony. The history that you are taking readings from was written during the time of the establishment of the colony, between 1630 and 1650, but it was lost and not published until the end of the 19th century. It focuses on their struggles. It focuses on their journey to the New World and their struggles to establish the colony in the New World and the hardships that they went through, providing sustenance, battling the Indians in some cases, treating with them in others. And it really is written in a way that is indicative of this sort of Pilgrim Puritan state of mind. They look at history as something that should be recorded and interpreted to see the will of God. So pay very close attention to how biblical allusions are woven into the history. Pay very close attention to how meaning is attributed to certain events. There's a lot of specific events that Bradford then goes back and says, well, this is why this happened, or this happened as a result of these things going on, and it showed God's will and God's providence in these particular ways. So really pay very close attention to that. Specific incidences to focus on, of course, the drowning of the sailor who mocks the Pilgrims is an obvious one. But the way that they behave, I think, is very important, especially at first. The way that they deal with the natives, that they're very tentative around the natives, that they make every attempt to appease the natives. Even in the case where they take some of the natives' corn, they consider it borrowing. They intend to pay them back. Look at the Mayflower Compact, which is very important. The first self-governing document of self-governance in the New World, which was put into place because of conflicts between the Pilgrims and the sailors that came with them. Remember that the Pilgrims brought with them, following John Smith's advice, they brought with them tradespeople, people who could provide services that were important to the livelihood of the colony and the survival of the colony. So those people had to be incorporated somehow into a governing structure. It is important to note, though, that the Pilgrims were, unlike the Puritans, the Pilgrims were not really concerned with political structure so much. Even though they did do the Mayflower Compact, they did it because they really had to. They had to provide some sort of sense of order, and you'll read why that was the case. But they are not really a political group. They're a spiritual group. I mean, their name, they're pilgrims, right? They're a group that is going on a pilgrimage, in this case, not to a holy place, but to a place that they intend to make holy, which I think is very important. They didn't see the New World as a promised land flowing with milk and honey. They knew it was going to be tough, but they went there to try to reshape the world around their own beliefs. I think that's an important thing to take into consideration when you read William Bradford's work. One of the major incidents that we focus on when studying American literature is the Marymount incident, and we get two versions of that. You get William Bradford's version, and you get Thomas Morton's version, which is very different. And it's important to note that they come from very different perspectives. Make sure that you read the background on Thomas Morton and understand where he's coming from. That he is not a Puritan. He is not a Pilgrim. He is what we would refer to as a Cavalier. He is one of the sort of secular elite, or considers himself one of the secular elite, but he's in that vein. He does believe in religion, and he's Church of England, but his perspective is very different than the Puritans, very different than the Pilgrims. And in a lot of ways, his New English Canaan is a satire. He's mocking the Pilgrims and their beliefs because he sees them as backward. He sees them as silly, really. Even to the extent where he mocks Miles Standish's Captain Shrimp, right? He's going to call out his physical shortcomings because he just sees them as ridiculous and silly. According to Bradford's point of view, Thomas Morton was a renegade. He was someone who was doing things that was going to bring danger and harm to the Plymouth colony. And his adventure at Marymount, which was close to the Plymouth colony, he felt like it was something that needed to be shut down because he was selling guns to the natives. He was getting them drunk. Supposedly, his men were sleeping with native women. So it was a combination of sort of sin and immorality, also with danger. If they actually were selling guns is arguable because Morton never admits to that being the case. In New English Canaan, it is kind of difficult to read. I'll go ahead and tell you that. It's pretty difficult to read because of the style that it's written in. It's written in this mock heroic style where he makes lots and lots of classical allusions. One thing to note is just really the difference in style. Bradford writes very plainly, very clearly, even though some of the wording, the word choices may be archaic and may sound a little strange and the syntax may be a little odd, it is still much easier to read than Morton's poem. Morton's poem is very playful, but it's also very deeply textured. And that's really part of the style at the time, of that sort of grand heroic, mock heroic style that was popular in England, was sort of the intellectual crew there who he was appealing to and what he comes out of, the tradition he comes out of. Whereas Bradford's writing is very much in what we refer to as the plain style of the writing of the Pilgrims and the Puritans. I mean, he's focusing on facts. At the same time, he's making connections to significance and biblical allusions, but he's writing very clearly because he wants to communicate as clearly as possible what's going on, what happened, why he thinks it happened. Whereas Morton's writing is much more written to entertain. It's written for his audience. So two very different styles, two very different audiences. It is important to note that Morton's criticisms of the Pilgrims are very much diametrically opposed to their criticisms of him. He sees them as being religious but not being humane, basically having no sense of humor, having no sympathy or empathy. They see him as basically the reverse, as seeing somebody who's too wildly emotional, too reckless, who has no sense of propriety and no sense of boundaries. So that's their criticism, and of course they eventually shut him down.